Hi, everyone.
Recording in progress.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to our Women's History Month Lunch and Learn. As you all are joining, we'll give you a few minutes and we'll get started just after 12 o'clock. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. We see you joining. We're happy to have you here. Welcome to our Women's History Month Lunch and Learn. We're so glad that you're joining us today. We hope that you have your lunch. It is a lunch and learn, so feel free to eat and kick back and enjoy our session today. We're just going to let a few more of you join. Come on in. Happy Women's History Month. I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Asha Smith, Director of the Office of Equity and Human Rights, and we are back for our March Lunch and Learn session in celebration of Women's History Month. This year's theme is Women Who Advocate for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We're joined by Dr. Lisa Harp and Joanna Colosimo, I hope I said that correctly, of DCI Consulting Group. Joanna Colosimo is the Vice President of Workforce Equity and Compliance Strategy at DCI Consulting. She leads a division of psychologists, advanced HR practitioners, and analysts who consult with organizations on fair practices, compliance requirements, pay equity solutions, audit strategies, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Lisa Grant Harp is an industrial psychologist and director of HR and EEO analytics. She's a principal consultant in the Employment and Litigation Services Division of DCI Consulting. She assists companies in the evaluation of the fairness of their employment practices. This includes statistical and qualitative analysis of hiring, performance appraisals, compensation, and promotion practices, as well as coordination with attorneys and employers involved in discrimination litigation or the Fair Contract Compliance Program audits. She has 20 years of experience in industrial psychology and statistical analysis. So that's a lot of credentials. I mean, in case you're wondering, they're very smart women, very, very smart women. I had the pleasure of hearing them speak last year at the International Association of Human Rights Agencies conference. And they were phenomenal. They presented the information in a way that was engaging and interesting, and I think every woman should know critical information about how we are paid and what that means for our outcomes in our future. So before 2 cents for every dollar that men earned. So a man earns $1, a woman is going to earn 82 cents on that dollar. That's really not changed very meaningfully since 2002. For Black women, the numbers are more abysmal. It's 67 cents for every dollar that men earn. For Hispanic women, it's 57 cents. For Native American women, it's 55 cents. So another thing to know is that the gap varies based on your age. The younger you are, the narrower the gap. The older you are, the wider it gets. The gap persists despite the fact that women are more likely than men to have graduated from college. In fact, it widens slightly with higher education. So the gap between what men and women get paid actually increases with more education that women have. Women are overrepresented in lower paying jobs. This is something that's been cited as perhaps contributing to the gap. Opinions do vary about whether the gap is due to gender discrimination. 60% of women say yes, there's discrimination in the workplace and it contributes to differences in pay. 37% of men say that there is gender discrimination. Um, Motherhood seems to reduce women's earnings, but it also seems to increase men's earnings. So fatherhood increases men's earnings. As women have children, their income goes down. As men have children, their income goes up. 59% of women are living paycheck to paycheck compared to 41% of men. 57% of women do not have an emergency fund. Women generally outlive men, but do not prioritize retirement savings to the same extent as men. Women have 70% of the retirement income that men do, even though we live longer. Older women are more likely than men to live below the poverty line. 50% of couples divorce. Women usually wind up primary caregivers, which decreases their earning power and increases household costs. Women pay more for mortgages than men, though they are better at paying mortgages than men. The gender wealth gap currently reflects that for every dollar that men own, different from what they earn, but for every dollar of wealth that men have, a woman has 32 cents. That is, for me, shocking. And for Black and Hispanic women, it is 1 penny. 1 penny for every dollar of wealth that men own. Well, if this is not enough for you to want to hear more, I don't know what's going to do it. So I'm now going to turn it over to our wonderful presenters and thank them for being here with us today. I'm going to mute up.
Thank you. Thank you, Asha. We really appreciate the introduction. We really appreciate being invited back. And those are some, some shocking statistics. Like Lisa and I have delved into a lot of the research related to gender wage gap issues, but you also got, had some really quality pieces of information related to other issues related to wealth and lifetime earnings and the assets that people kind of pursue. And so Lisa and I wanted to spend a little bit of time today talking a little bit more about our expertise, which we teed up very, very beautifully at the start of this. And we do a lot of work with organizations, with employers on their own internal pay issues, their own internal pay equity issues, looking at the data, looking at their policies and practices to say, is there something going on here in your organization and how can we overcome that? And so Lisa and I want to spend a little bit of time. We call our presentation A Tale of Two Pay Gaps because we wanted to talk a little bit about what we hear with some of these alarming statistics that you all probably hear about in the news that we discussed, based on all these different research resources. But we also wanted to talk a little bit about how organizations posture their data when you hear things that are publicly reported so that you can start asking questions for yourself of like, well, what is that statistic really telling me? And, what can we do about it? And ultimately, we'd love to hear from you all on any questions that you have. I am driving this screen, so if there's a question that pops up and I can't see it, Elisa and Asha, feel free to jump in and interrupt me at any point in time, and we can handle them as we go. And we'll leave a little bit of time at the end for questions as well. But with that, I did want to kind of get us started. Lisa and I will talk a little bit about this background of pay equity and a little bit of like the legal framework, because that tells us a little bit about society of like when were laws passed. Then we want to talk a little bit about that difference between the pay gap or the wage gap and pay equity, what organizations are doing to actually overcome pay equity in their own organizations, and like what a proper pay study actually addresses. And then we just want to really set the stage for the future and like what we're seeing in the entire employment landscape. And if you don't know, we are a Washington, D.C. based company. I'm actually a Maryland resident, like probably many of you on the phone as well. I know we're in a national sort of, or a state-wide state of mourning and distress today. And so I'm sending out positive vibes for any of you that are touched by the accident in Baltimore today. But we want to talk a little bit about how our day-to-day jobs and what's going on in that social context is going to continue to come up with regards to women and the impact of women, and what they're paid and the wealth that they maintain over time. So we're excited to talk about all of that. And so I would love to jump in on this background of anti-discrimination laws and pay transparency. And this slide might be a little overwhelming to anybody watching it. It's a whole timeline. I'm not going to go into the whole timeline, but what I find interesting here, and I'll point out to everybody, is that in 1963, many, many decades ago, the United States government passed at a federal level the Equal Pay Act, right? And that's where for women and men doing equal work, they should be paid fairly, right? So that was passed 1963, but keep in mind there's this equal work threshold, which is important to highlight. In 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was passed and covered a lot of different protected classes, and one of those protections was in compensation. And so it's been many decades. We've had some key cases, and you can see through the timeline, the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s. We had a smattering of pay cases. We had a smattering of milestones. The Civil Rights Act was amended. In the late 90s, the Boeing pay related case was a big case, especially in our field. Lisa and I that's something we refer back to and study. But it wasn't, if you look at the top line, how many decades was that before you had milestone of news, right? 1960s to the end of 1999. It's really been in the last 20 years where we have seen more activity on pay transparency, fairness, pay cases that are actually being enforced. I even highlighted some discrimination related cases in things like even reverse discrimination cases, as we'll talk about later, because that is sort of the social lay of the land. There has been more conversation in the last decade, and I've been doing this work for about shy of 20 years, like about 17 years. Lisa, a little longer. I won't age her. Lisa, a little longer. But between the two of us, we've really even seen the last decade really ramp up with organizations saying, we need to do something as a commitment to pay equity. Employees and applicants and state governments holding employers accountable for doing something by either passing pay transparency laws or forcing pay data collection. And so the conversation's just not going to end, right? Which is good, because what we heard at the beginning of this session and the statistics that were cited was that gender pay gap has been flat for about the last 20 years. It really has. And there's, potentially a lot of reasons for that. And we'll dig into that in just a moment. One thing I wanted to highlight before we kind of really dig into the pay equity, and I think this is important because it's so important for us to monitor what's happening at the federal level, because ultimately sometimes what's happening at the federal level will trickle down to the states. Your county might even adopt some of these policies in the future. Who knows? We always want to watch what's going on at the federal level. But a few years ago, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, had an add-on to what is called the EEO-1 report for private employers. For state and local offices, it's actually called the EEO-4 report, but this was really applicable to private employers. And they added on to this report a pay data collection. It went back and forth in the courts and was eventually rescinded, but organizations still had to report their 2017, 2018 pay data. And the reason I'm telling you this is that there was this whole long drawn out drama about access to this report and what the value of reporting pay data by a pay band would actually be. But ultimately this month, just a few weeks ago, not even a few weeks ago, maybe 10 days ago, EEOC did release the results of their analyses for this pay data by industry, technology sector, energy sector. And keep in mind, this data is really aggregate. How employers reported it was by W-2 box earnings in a pay band scheme. And what we learned was that, if I just had one major takeaway with this data reporting, there are certainly limitations with it, but with this data reporting, women were on average one pay band lower than men in this data. And there's a potential slew of reasons for why that could be. Again, keep in mind this was for private employers with 100 or more, people in their organization, but it's an important statistic for us to talk about, because what's going to happen is that statistic is going to be dissected at the federal level. And what's going to happen is that we think at the federal level, EEOC is going to look to bring back this pay report. So what that does is kind of holds organizations a little bit more accountable for the pay decisions that they're making, right? If we are forcing certain organizations to comply with pay data collection, the impetus of the federal government is, well, great, it's transparent now. We want you to do something with it. The data doesn't actually answer questions about pay equity. We don't have all the reasons as to why maybe that women are on average one pay band lower than men. Lisa and I will talk to them in an anecdotal perspective of what we see with data. My team personally handled hundreds of these filings on behalf of organizations, so I can speak to some of the data integrity issues that happened. But some of the statistics at the start of this presentation in fact highlighted them. You might have had people that were out of the office for a period of time, so they didn't get the wages. Women were often in lower paying jobs in the organizations that, I filed for, my team filed for. So there's a lot of anecdote into this conversation. And with that, I would really love to turn it over to Lisa to talk a little bit about this difference and this nuanced difference between the pay gap and pay equity. So Lisa, take it away.
Thanks, Joanne. I appreciate that. And I did have one follow-up on what you were saying about the EO1 report, because I do think that bigger picture for everybody, you're seeing really across the globe, people trying to figure out, governments trying to figure out how to address pay issues. And so we're seeing reporting after reporting requirement in the UK and Iceland and all kinds of countries. And so I think the US is really struggling with what they're going to require for reporting purposes, but I think we're going to continue to see that trend. I know in government agencies, there's often more transparency in terms of what different bands pay for and different levels pay for, but I think we can expect all kinds of agencies to be looking at what kind of information should employers report, so that we can kind of push the envelope a little bit in terms of pay equity. And so, and I think the other, you mentioned that 82 cents on the dollar, and that's not really consistent, as this slide shows, I think, with what we hear in the press, right? So, we get these headlines that say Amazon pays women and men equally, Facebook and Microsoft achieve pay equality, equal pay to women. And so that's really inconsistent with what we're seeing from these other agencies that are reporting these statistics. And there's a reason for that. And that's because these are pay gap numbers, and they're often adjusted. And I'll talk about that in just a second. But I did really want to highlight, I think one takeaway is becoming really informed on the difference between a pay gap and a pay equity study, and when information is being reported on the two different kinds of studies. A pay gap study is kind of an overall, company-wide, country-wide, whatever that level of analysis is. It's everybody in one study, and it's comparing the average pay of men to the average pay of women. And we'll talk in a minute about actually within even the pay gap, there are two different pay gap numbers that you might see. But I think the key here is just to understand that it's everybody in one big analysis. And so you'll even see companies, when they report their pay gap numbers, they'll be very careful in their wording to say, this is not a Title VII analysis. This does not compare similarly situated employees. So they're very careful in their wording. And this comes up often. I feel like over time, it doesn't come up quite as much, but I'll have an employer come and be interested in doing a study. And it's only through a couple of conversations that I figure out whether it's a pay gap or a pay equity study. Typically, companies want to do a pay gap study if they want to look at it kind of big picture, but also if they want to publish the numbers. And so you will never see, well, not now, you will not see companies reporting on pay equity studies, but you will see them reporting on these big aggregate type studies. And
Lisa,
then
just if you could pause
yeah,
just for a question, just a quick question.
sure.
So in general, will a pay gap study give more favorable numbers than a pay equity study?
What in general, and I'll talk because and in essence, what you'll see employers do is in this big, it's basically one big regression. They will start putting in different job or structural variables to show a decreasing of that gap. And most of them will continue to put whatever factors they can until that gap is pretty much 1 to 1. And so it's one of the biggest issues I have with these kind of studies. I think they can be informative. I think, in particular, the unadjusted wage gap is really just that all women, not controlling for anything, what's their average pay compared to the men? And if women are in lower paying jobs, you're going to see the gap be larger. As women are evenly distributed in kind of the pay levels, that gap's going to be smaller. And so I think the unadjusted gap can give you a lot of information about kind of where women lie in terms of the different levels of jobs. And then for the adjusted gap, you start controlling for everything. So you control for job, you control for geographic differential, but then you don't have to stop there. You can control for performance and other job information and tenure type variables until you get really the desired outcome, which is going to be that 1 to 1.
And which I think, Lisa, to your point, we went back to the newsreel slide. That's usually what you're seeing reported. So when you see just to like
It's
hit the drive
adjusted.
home, when you see organizations that are saying, "Oh, we have pay parity," it's likely the adjusted wage gap. They likely took everybody, they controlled for things. And to your point, Lisa, there's value in that. They controlled for things like job, maybe the location, the geography. They're legitimate explanatory variables, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what an unadjusted wage gap would tell you.
And it is why those numbers are inconsistent with what we think of when we think of that 82 cents on the dollar. It's like, why, how could they be at 100%? It's because it's a different kind of analysis. And so this is just an example of that unadjusted pay gap. And I think the last it kind of varies. I think this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics at 82, 83 cents on the dollar. But you can see there for women versus men, it really is just average pay ratio to the men's average pay, about 83 cents on the dollar. And so that's what we usually hear when we hear that pay gap number reported. And every company who reports an adjusted pay gap has an unadjusted pay gap too, but it's less. They're certainly not going to publish it, although there has certainly been movement, in particular from some of the shareholder groups like Arjuna, to report both the unadjusted and the adjusted wage gap. And so just to kind of hit it home, this kind of plays off of those published numbers. This is from the last Arjuna. Arjuna does put out an annual report where they report all kinds of things. And as time has gone on, they've been requiring companies to report more and more information, including the unadjusted. They're starting to push on providing race gaps as well. And so you're seeing them really become kind of understanding what the companies are doing and making them report more and more information so you know exactly what you're getting. Because, all of these you can see are, the worst one is 99.3 for Pfizer there. And these are all adjusted pay gaps, but we don't know what's controlled for in any of those. So one might just control for job, one might control for like 20 different variables. And so can you compare them? I'd be a little hesitant to do that, but I think by looking at the unadjusted and the adjusted over time, you can get a better idea of kind of what's going on in that organization.
That's a really good point, Lisa, in terms of we don't necessarily always know the details of when an organization becomes public with their own numbers. We don't know how they controlled for
Yep.
the data, but this has become really popular in probably the past decade, where organizations, because of pressure from their applicants, their employees, from these shareholder groups that are activists, looking for, some sort of social accountability, many of these types of organizations are going public. What we saw was like in their ESG reports or their corporate responsibility type reports, they'd be publishing these types of metrics. And so there became sort of a backlash. We can continue to hear these organizations saying, "Oh, we have pay parity. We're at 99 cents to the dollar. We're, a dollar for a dollar," like on the slide that you see here. And in sort of the public eye and in the shareholder eye, people said, we know what you're up to.
Yeah.
That's an adjusted wage gap. We want to know. We want to know a little bit more. And the corporations there's two sides to every tale, right? Like that's why we have a tale of two big gaps. Corporations are like, but we controlled for legitimate things. We control for location and geographic difference and role or whatever else, they may have controlled for, which is a completely fair conversation. But if we really want to get at the heart of this, and we started this conversation with, okay, this gap has still persisted. What the heck are we going to do to overcome it? That's an important conversation. I love this quote, Lisa, because what the wage gap in the adjusted wage gap does and doesn't tell us, um, I love this quote from she's actually the former VP of government relations at AAUW, and she was testifying on this last few years. She's like, okay, sure, corporations, it's accurate for what it claims to be, maybe a lack of pay gap when looking at the same jobs, they're controlling for these nuances, but it doesn't get at the broader issue of women being underrepresented in certain fields and in leadership positions. So if we go back to the start of the conversation on a lot of the key drivers, at least that Lisa and I see, there are multiple drivers, but a lot of the key drivers of these large scale macro level pay gaps often are driven by talent distribution. Where are people in their careers? Who's in leadership positions? Is it men? Who are in the higher paying STEM careers. And that is oftentimes telling us a macro level story of talent distribution. It's not everything. It's not getting at every nuanced pay equity issue that could exist in an organization. And Lisa's going to spend the second half of this presentation talking about that, like how can we uncover this within our organization. But just keep in mind when you see these statistics and you see it splashed on the front page of a newspaper, probably um, what's happening and what we're getting at. And so, oh, oops. So one thing that we want to be thoughtful of, it doesn't want to stay on that slide, Lisa. I don't know what's going on. That's okay. We're gonna take it as a sign to move on, Joanna. But one thing that we want to kind of really drive home is that the pay gap, it's interesting information. It tells us really high level, macro level trends, but it's not actually answering the question of pay equity. So pay equity is more of that role to role comparison. Are people that are doing the same jobs, um, getting paid, equitably or fairly? And that's a different conversation. We need to do really nuanced pay analyses. We need to really look at examining pay components. We need to look at the policies and procedures of an organization. But what we can use the pay gap for, what that 82 cents or the 83 cents on the dollar macro level tells us there's still something going on, right? There's still something happening. And from an anecdotal perspective, Lisa and I can't tell you every story because some of it's confidential, some of it's privileged. But if I just gave you an anecdotal takeaway, we do see that it's a combination of factors often driving that wage gap, anecdotally. We can see that sometimes organizations might have some of those pay equity issues and they exist in pockets. We see that, starting salary can continue to be a problem of how we pay people when they first start in a job. And then we also continue to see that talent distribution and really understanding if women are in leadership positions that are paid highly. Are women in the positions in your organization that pay more? What does the market pay for those certain jobs? And we do see a concentration of women and women of color in lower paying jobs. And there are a variety of reasons. And what an organization can do to overcome some of those distribution questions is do more than just a pay analysis. This really becomes a holistic conversation of what are we doing in our hiring process? Is our hiring process fair? Is our promotion process equitable and fair? Is it structured in a way that we're actually evaluating the competencies of the job and putting people into positions that should be there and will be successful in there, and kind of mitigating bias in that promotion process? And then one thing that's so overlooked, that I was just talking to a legal counsel yesterday for a company, is really terminations and tenure. And this really hits that diversity profile. Are women leaving your organization? And I've done some studies where we've compared pay data for an organization, and then we just could never figure out what the main driver of their pay gap was because they didn't have actual pay equity issues. And Lisa will talk to you about that. There's a difference. You could have a pay gap and not have a pay equity issue.
Mhm.
And we started to look at the data. It was like, oh, women are choosing to not go into promoted positions, or they're being chilled. They had a chilling effect of not wanting to accept promotions into leadership positions for a variety of reasons. There was a variety of organizational toxic reasons for that, but we noticed this barrier at promotion where this certain like mid to senior level management positions where you start to earn more, right, where your wealth really starts being maximized. And women were just not being promoted nearly, like even close to the same rate as men in the organization. And also at that same level, and I have a visual in my head of how the data looked, and that's why I'm using this little crossbar. It was so visual. It was not only like we were hiring women at the same rate as men, we were, all this stuff. It was at this one level promotions, but they were also turning over at this level. So for them to start to diagnose their wage gap, they had to actually start pulling the curtain back on their organizational employee life cycle and really start to say, wow, women are leaving between mid and senior level management. They're not getting promoted. We need to invest in this policy to correct the wage gap issue. And I think that's just one of the main takeaways. Lisa said, this is a really holistic process to get at these root causes. And it's not easy. It's not always just about, okay, well, we offered the woman this and the man this for the entry level position. That's one aspect. That is something that needs to be looked at, but it can be these other nuanced things that are causing this impact, and it really takes a village to kind of look under the curtain. I'll
I have a
pause.
quick
Oh, go ahead.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So and we have a couple questions in the
Okay.
chat. So
Yeah.
first I want to ask, in the course of doing this work, do you ask women, do you go back to these companies and do any kind of a qualitative analysis on the factors that are preventing women from seeking or going into leadership positions? I know one of the things that I've heard a lot, and I can tell you it's been true in my own career. I've been checked by some really well-meaning men about this. They'll say a woman disqualifies herself from a job much more quickly than a man would.
Yeah.
So a woman will determine that, look at the duties or qualifications for a position, determine that she's not qualified because she doesn't meet all of them, and not apply. Whereas the conventional wisdom is that men will see a list of qualifications and have two or three and say, you know what, I can grow into this.
Yep.
I'm going to go for it. And I don't know the extent to which you've found that that's true.
Such a great point. And yeah, if I said something that made it feel like we were victim blaming women, for sure that was
Oh,
not the
no,
case.
I
But
didn't get
yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah, no. And so for sure, and I'll be transparent with you. Let me tell you a business thing first as a chuckle, and then we can go. It depends. To answer a question like, do you go in and talk to people qualitative? We do that. Lisa and I have a background in IO psychology, and we'll sometimes do focus groups. We usually lead with the data, right? So we'll do like data analysis first to find the hot spots, like where are the hot spots, and then kind of dig into those hot spots with interviews, with understanding a little bit more about processes and policies from decision makers, plus perceptions, like employee perceptions. Absolutely. But it just depends. My chuckle was, it just depends if somebody's willing to pay us for that. So everyone's, lots of times we do a lot of analytical work, like, oh, we just want to pay you for a pay equity study. And like, that's where it, stops. And the organization, where we hope we give the organization recommendations, to your point, Asha, of, okay, here's some questions you should be asking. Here's some things you should be uncovering. And, you kind of hope that they're doing that internally. So I just wanted to tell you that truthfully, that happens to us for sure. That, organizations only have so many resources, and they pay us for our analytical expertise, and they might say, okay, give us the toolkit response, and then we'll go do it. But certainly, Lisa and I have been in interviews. Oh my goodness, Lisa, I can think of several projects. One major project that happened in the COVID era, where we were sitting on those landscape interviews and we were hearing people's perceptions, of what happened to them during their promotion process, or what happened to them during uh, an initial hiring process. And usually what it comes down to, from my perspective, is unstructured things that companies in trouble is when they put together unstructured processes, like a selection process that may have been different from one person to another, or it wasn't a well thought out process, a promotion process. And that they did list something in the job announcement that didn't necessarily need to be there, and so I think these are all really good takeaways. There's so many takeaways we could talk about, but
Yeah.
Lisa, I'll pause. I want to give it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's a great point about the seeing, here's the promotion, here are the qualifications, and the woman says, I don't meet all of those, or I'm not confident I do, so I'm just not going to apply. Versus, a male who sees him and goes, "Well, I got a couple of those, so I'm going to apply," which is a very different issue than not, than applying and not getting selected. It's just not putting your hat in the ring. And it reminds me of, the research on salary negotiations at starting salary, and what you've seen kind of a recognition that that can definitely be an issue. And so you've seen with state regulations in particular a ban on using prior salary history as part of your negotiations and as part of the process for setting pay because of those kind of issues. And so my hope is going to be that as we try to address pay equity, more of these issues become salient, and there are more little pushes put on employers to say, hey, are you giving everybody the information they need to make a decision about promotions? And so addressing some of those things about, do you have to have every single qualification, encouraging women to apply for those promotions. So I think that it's a great point, though. And hopefully we'll see something as we go through this.
We do have a question in the chat about why companies don't do pay equity studies. So this person says, is it a matter of cost and privacy that would prevent a company from doing an equity study, or is it mostly a matter of publicity? So surely we'd like your opinion on that. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it costs for, a company to undertake a pay equity study, to the extent that you can, divulge that.
Oh, so
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
great. Go ahead, Lisa. Yeah.
cost is always an issue. And what I tend to see is, so in a good way, it tends to be the larger organizations that tend to come to us for the pay equity analyses. They have more money. They are invested in trying to understand whether or not there are equity issues, and they employ a lot more people. So the impact's larger. So that's good on that side. When you get to smaller and medium-sized companies, one, quite often they don't have the data keeping processes that would lend itself to having the available data. So they know that's a big hurdle. So it's a little bit of cost, and also the time it would take for us to get the data would be a real issue. And luckily they know, don't analyze bad data. And then the third one, which I really don't hear about as much, the other thing that sometimes can stop companies is they're scared of what they'll find. Um, and that's not necessarily a malicious intent. It's we don't have the money to fix it if we do find something. So they're more, so hopefully they're doing some internal things and trying to look at it. But those are some of the reasons why I hear employers say, yeah, we just can't do it right now. But I'm seeing more and more smaller companies come to us. Joanna and I were talking about this, about how, my team does all kinds of analyses. 99% of it is pay equity, because that is what employers are interested in, and they want to do the right thing, and they're expanding from looking at just base to other kinds of compensation. I think I would love employers to do kind of the pay equity and the pay gap and use all that information. And in particular, I think that unadjusted wage gap can tell you've got a distribution issue, putting in place some things to try to address that. And if it changes over time and that unadjusted gap narrows, you really know that you've been getting women up into some of those higher paying jobs, which is just the other side of that picture, I think.
Yeah. And then I'll add on to the question, because there's two things that kind of came up that was beautiful, Lisa. One, are companies afraid of confidentiality? We don't see that much at DCI, because typically organizations will try to cover an initial pay equity study under privilege, like under attorney-client privilege. So they'll keep those results close to their chest, meaning legal counsel, HR, compensation team members might have access to the results so that they can remediate whatever. I do see organizations that will keep that close to their chest, but not go publicly on like reporting a pay gap. Like they just handle it under privilege in-house. So we don't see that too much. Where we see organizations want to push back on the kind of confidentiality is more of the transparency of, like, they'll do that kind of work under privilege, keep it, in-house under legal purview, but they don't really want to go, like I said, publicly. And they don't like the pressure. Some organizations just don't like the pressure of like their shareholders to go public with the information, because they think it, could be legal risk to them, which, is, makes sense, from a legal perspective. And the second question is, how much does something like this cost? It kind of depends on what you're looking for. If you're looking for a pay equity study for your organization, usually the factors that dictate cost are like, how big is your organization? What kind of data points do you have? And so smaller organizations, will have a different price point. Probably, closer like a 5-figure study, whereas like a really large, like international company could even potentially still stay in the 5 figures, but could even get to 6 figures depending on what they're trying to do. Like if they want to buttress up a study that's pay related with what I talked about with like the policy review and the focus groups and all of that, that's usually where time and effort and energy and really due diligence can kind of come into effect. But yeah, it really just varies how big your organization and what kind of data is available. So to Lisa's point, if your organization has some good data, like, we can account for things like tenure, that might be a simpler study, less time. But if the organization is pretty complex and there's geographic differences in how people are paid or, other really complex factors, it just takes more time. So it's a good question. But
Thank
no,
you for that.
yeah.
So I want to let you guys go ahead and then reserve a block of time at the end.
Okay.
We're getting some good questions in the chat, and I want to make sure that we have time to get to them. So go ahead.
Yeah, no worries. And we'll transition, Lisa. I want to tee it up for you for Lisa to talk to us about actually conducting a proactive pay equity study. And the thing that I want to make clear, and I'm gonna give an example, is I did a wage gap for an organization. I'm gonna kind of change the facts just so we don't get into trouble here. But essentially, we did a wage gap study, and their unadjusted wage gap for men to women was pretty crazy. It was like 67 cents on the dollar, right? It was like there was a huge gap. When we adjusted for it, it went to like 92 cents on the dollar. And legal counsel's like, okay, great. How do we make it go away? Like, can you just calculate what pay adjustments need to be made to make that go away? And it's like, okay, that's not. And Latino obviously said, like, well, that's not really how that works. If we want to do pay adjustments, we really should do a pay equity study because you don't want to just throw money to make the 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 figure go away. We want to do it thoughtfully. We need to adjust people that are in similarly situated jobs, right? Like we shouldn't just throw an adjustment at the administrative assistant that's supporting the president of the company. Those are two different jobs. We want to be thoughtful about our approach, right? So I set that up and I turned it over to Lisa to talk a little bit about that nuance in proactive pay equity studies for us.
Great. And so I'm not obviously not going to go through all these, but as I was mentioning, one kind of impetus for doing pay equity studies is absolutely regulations. So we have federal regulations, we have state-based regulations, we have international pay laws, and in particular, those state-based and international have just been exploding over the last decade. And as I mentioned, I think what's interesting about a lot of the state-based ones is they're not just they don't just have regulations requiring pay equity among similarly situated employees, but they're also hitting it from pay transparency. So they're saying you can't retaliate against somebody if they ask about their pay, requiring organizations to post information about their pay, often at least by like level or by band, as well as that piece I mentioned about salary bans on using prior salary history. And there is some evidence that we're seeing an effect from that. I think that, for one, we're seeing employees come in and say, we want to know what you're doing about pay equity. So there's a lot more openness with that. I have a lot more employers who I do pay equity studies for, and they say, we want to get this information to our employees. And that's something I never would have heard, 10 years ago. And that's when the attorneys go, whoa, wait a minute, let's talk about what we want to do. But they're very dedicated to, making sure their employees know the situation and if they're making pay adjustments or if they have any issues. So that's the main thing I wanted to bring up with that. And then really, the main studies, and this is a lot of different steps, but I think that is something that companies need to understand. If you're going to do a good pay equity study, you need to commit the resources. And it's typically upfront when we're basically kind of figuring out the model or how we want to analyze the data, how we want to group employees, and on the back end when we get to some of the results. And so, kind of the key points though are, identifying appropriate groupings. So making sure you understand who truly is similarly situated in terms of job content, looking at your policies and procedures and identifying those job related factors that influence pay. And then depending on the size of the groups, there are different kinds of analytic methods you can look at. And then I think the other thing that a lot of employers don't think about is after the end, after we've done that initial run. And to Joanna's point, I certainly have some clients who say, oh, there's some differences. Well, just tell us how much we have to change it. But you really need to dig in, because it's very rare that we have all the factors that influence pay data on that. And so there's always this step of what do I do with the results, and making sure you dig in to those specific groups where you do have disparities and try to understand why they are there, and can you justify them. And only once you've identified we can't justify them, then you really need to talk about salary adjustments. The other thing I've found with doing these pay equity studies is it's not uncommon to identify practices that aren't helping the organization. I think one of the biggest ones that I see is transfers or demotions without changing pay. And so you've got some companies who it makes sense, somebody's got a demotion, they've been here a long time, we don't want to decrease their pay. But if that's happening to more men, then you're going to have a pay equity issue. And so I've seen, quite often in that kind of results discovery or investigation, you actually identify practices that need to be discussed about whether do we want to keep doing this way. Go on the next one. And so that one really is just, again, kind of, reiterating that I think that, companies who want to do these studies need to make sure they really spend some time up front talking about who really is similarly situated, what factors really do influence pay, and do we have the data to measure those things? And then on the back end, really spending some time looking at those groups where there are disparities to figure out, do we have a real issue? Do we have a policy or practice issue we need to address? Do we need to make an adjustment at this time?
Such a great point, Lisa. And I'll wrap us up so we have plenty of time for questions. So, like, essentially, what does all of this mean? What does this mean for the future? Lisa and I, we are predicting that there will continue to be external pressures for pay transparency. We will continue to see state laws, forcing this matter for organizations, things like in job posting information. And again, Lisa, to your point, we're talking to a county system. State and local and federal government officials and agencies tend to have a little bit more transparency than maybe private organizations. But so this is really kind of pushing private organizations a little bit further, but having more of that transparency is going to come. We think that also will include pay data reporting, like I mentioned earlier, at the federal level, and that has also been supplemented with other states. So Maryland isn't there yet, but the state of Illinois and the state of California right now, we support clients and reporting pay data, to those state agencies reporting pay data for private organizations. So we're going to continue to see those. We definitely think that's like the next 5 years or so. I do think we're going to continue to see shareholder lawsuits over pay and selection issues. And I say shareholders, I mean groups. And now what we're seeing, it used to be more like liberal groups, organizations that were pushing the bounds of social justice, of saying, okay, we're shareholders that have invested in your company. We want to see the results of your pay equity study. We want to see the results of your wage gap study, or we want to see, information about moving the needle on diversity and representation in your organization. So we've seen that a lot in the past decade. And we talked a little bit about Arjuna Capital. Lisa mentioned them. They're an activist shareholder group that has really pushed the bounds on publicly disclosing. But what I am seeing now, and this goes to my third point, is, and this is where we're defending some clients behind the scenes, we're seeing sort of the counter to that. So shareholder lawsuits are now coming on both forms, both sort of conservative pressure and liberal, more like liberal type pressure. So both left and right wing organizations pushing organizations, to be more fair and more open on the transparency of their policies and practices and decision. One thing I would like to say, though, is that when it comes to pay, we still see more of the pressure on, the left side, because we still see the pay gap for women and women of color. And so the conservative groups are a little bit more focused on the white male discrimination lawsuits when it comes to like selection. But as I said earlier, some of this is interrelated. Your pay gap sometimes is a product of our selection issues. It's a product of our promotion issues. So it's just something to be aware of in the current environment, is that we are seeing pressure from all different types of groups. We're seeing pressure from, it's a really hard time to be an organization right now, to be nimble, to handle making sure we're addressing the pay gap, but also making sure that we're keeping that we're coloring in the lines of the law. Like, I'll just keep it simple. Like, essentially, you know, race, gender, and ethnicity-based preferences, we need to be mindful, of those situations right now. I'll just keep it simple.
Yeah,
Oh,
well,
Lisa, go ahead.
yeah, I was
Yeah.
just gonna say, and the other thing though, that you're seeing the pressure from all kinds of places, and I think
Yep.
relevant for the county employees is and it was on the West Coast, so I don't know how long it'll take to move to the East Coast, but the Board of Commissioners agreed that the county needed to do a total pay equity study. And so and in that case, we did look at, kind of the pay equity studies. We looked at wage gap. We did focus groups. We looked at policies and
Mhm.
procedures. And so I'm seeing that a lot, company boards, university faculty committees. Here it was, again, a county board of commissioners who mandated that a pay equity study be done. And so you are seeing kind of a trend of that. And so that's probably the most relevant for some of the county employees, of whether or not that pressure comes to bear. But that certainly has happened for me.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Lisa. And we just have to be mindful of it. Like, as an
Yeah.
organization, pressures exist in all facets across the board. But so some action items for us to think about as we transition to question and answers. We really do want to think about who's involved in our pay equity studies, and if we have any sort of compliance-based reporting related to the county. And we want to talk about questions of privilege and confidentiality. And it really is a values-based conversation. Your legal counsel will want to be involved with something related to this. Um, and so we also want to talk about, like, what is included. So one thing that Lisa and I didn't touch on was, oftentimes pay equity studies focus mainly on base pay, like the base compensation. But, do you want to look at things like bonus, other total rewards? Is there equity in those outcomes? That's a great question. It's great. I think it's always great if you're new in your journey to start with base pay, because that's kind of where most wealth is for people. So if you're brand new, starting there is a great place. But over time, making sure that other outcomes are evaluated is really important. We want to make sure that our study is comparing similarly situated employees before we do an adjustment. So although there's so much value in that wage gap information that we talked about earlier, keep in mind the wage gap information isn't your tool to make salary adjustments. It's just answering a macro level statistic. It's really this more nuanced pay equity study that gets at that roll to roll comparison and making sure we're not, maybe messing up our own compensation systems. And then, I did want to leave us with, you know, if we just choose to do public disclosures, if Anne Arundel or anybody else, that you're representing, wants to do a public disclosure of things like a wage gap, just making sure that we're thinking about all the angles given the current environment that we're in, and making sure that we're really thinking thoughtfully before we go public with information, and that we have the right talking points. But with that, we have plenty of time for questions, and happy to dialogue.
Thank you so much. And thank you for such an informative and comprehensive look at this issue. For me, what I hear is, um, private companies that are well resourced are able to do this. And there are a lot of things that they should be considering. We should be skeptical when we see things in the newspaper about parity, because the gap persists and there are a lot of reasons for it,
Yep.
right? I want to go ahead to the chat now and take some of our questions. So first question is, um, do the same sort of pay gap analyses and issues apply to other identity-based pay disparities? So I think the question is race-based, disability-based pay gaps. Is it a similar analysis?
It's a great question. And I would say um, what I've seen is a lot of companies, most companies that I work with who do the gender gap also do a race gap.
Mhm.
You don't always see them publish it, but they also do that analysis. The issue with disability or even intersectional, so we're talking about Black women, for example, compared to white males. The issue becomes two things. One, for disability in particular, having good data on that. And then the other is, once you start breaking the categories into smaller and smaller groups, it just becomes harder and harder to do the analysis. We are starting, however, I do have one company. I think if we're going to see those kind of analyses for intersectional in particular, the wage gap is where we're going to see it first, because you are doing kind of a big picture look. And I do have one client who does intersection, does gender, race, and an intersectional look.
Yeah, and I would say I don't see disability that often, and I think some of that has to do with sample size as well,
Yeah.
Lisa, to your point. Like, yeah.
Right. Okay. We have another question about pay gaps in specific job sectors. So do you have information about pay gaps and inequities in female-led organizations or job sectors that are dominated by women, such as early childhood education, social services, nursing, etc.?
So at my fingertips, I do not have that information. However, Bureau of Labor Statistics is a really great resource for that, where we can actually look at different data points, additional, like you can actually, they like look at different sectors, energy sector, tech sector. But when we talk about female dominated, I will give you anecdotal feedback. It's fascinating. I do have a lot of healthcare clients. Like I represent a lot of healthcare. Healthcare is a female dominated industry. I anecdotally, without, giving away personal information, that I see more of a race and gender gap in that industry, more so than I do see a gender gap. Admittedly, I will tell you, like female dominated, like anecdotally, but it doesn't mean they don't have pay equity issues. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like you can look at the gender gap for like I have an organization that's like 75% female, high female, like executive board. They actually don't have a huge gender gap. They have some minority opportunities, they have some race ethnicity based opportunities, and they still have a couple pockets of pay equity issues. So I'm not saying it's like perfect, but there's certain departments that we start digging into and like there is a gender issue here. So it's, see what I'm saying? So the macro is almost like covering up some pockets of issues. So those are just anecdotes I wanted to share for somebody if you're looking for more of the anecdotal evidence. But Bureau of Labor Statistics, great source to look at the macro level trends there.
Awesome. All right. We have a question here that's a little bit more of a technical question. Do you know if the federal government is going to provide standard operating procedures for how to implement changes in the workforce that include consequences for not completing or submitting a report? Oftentimes, the report is just the report. It's treated as a checklist item being completed without any tools, resources, and consequences to make real change.
Great observation, great question. I'll try to keep it high level. So at the federal level right now, you kind of get a hand slap for not being compliant to fill out the EEOC's report. They don't currently have a component to report yet, but it will be revisited, and I'm sure they will roll it out with some of what they consider a toolkit, but it's often not it's usually not nuanced enough for organizations. Where I see the consequence coming in is at the state level. So for example, the state of California actually is fining employers, I think it's like $100 per employee that they fail to report. But I hear the question of, are we going to get an SOP? Are we going to get, I'll be transparent, we've been asking that of a Department of Labor agency for a really long time with pay equity. The problem is it's nuanced and people have different interpretations about which variables are important. So I think it's going to be a long way to go before an accurate SOP by the federal government is issued, or not accurate, but like a robust SOP that everybody agrees about. And that's just my take. Lisa, feel free to add anything there.
No, I agree 100%, which is why I'm glad that I've seen so many more employers just dedicated to pay equity. So they're the ones who want to go in and dig in and figure out what's going on and do we need to make adjustments, because to Joanna's point, there's some consistencies in pay practices, and then there's a lot of nuance within industry and company. And so to have, a standard operating procedures is just going to be a long way down the road.
It is.
In light of the fact that those standard operating procedures probably aren't coming anytime soon, I'd like to close with one question. What do you think women in 2024 should be doing when it comes to work? Right? Young women, women in, the middle stage of their career, women late in their careers, wherever you are, what is it that women need to remember, know, or do based on your experience that would be helpful?
I think, and I mentioned salary negotiations. You mentioned that kind of looking at the posting and saying I'm not qualified, finding a life coach or a work coach or somebody to practice and guide them through. Really asking the questions, believing in themselves. If they only have one qualification on there, going ahead and applying for it was the worst thing to do, to be turned down. So I think it's, for at least in my experience and from my view, it's more about taking the chances, and learning how to do that. I think that we just don't have, when we don't have women in those positions, we don't have as many people to emulate. And so it's really kind of, trying to work on that on ourselves with help from others as well.
Love it. And I'll just end with, do your research, know your worth,
Yeah.
when you're going
Yep.
into salaries. And then if I had a daughter today, I would absolutely encourage a STEM field, and I would encourage like research on the types of careers that you want to do. And if money is important to you, that is something to look at and look
Great. It's a great point.
into in terms of our careers. But there's so many more takeaways. Be an advocate for yourself is probably the number one. Great one, Lisa. Thank you so much for having us. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
We're thrilled that you were here. I think that this has been a helpful conversation. I don't know that women love talking about money and
Yeah, I agree.
those types of
I don't either.
issues. And so that's right. Women don't love talking about money, and I don't think sometimes we realize how behind we are. And behind maybe is a rough word, but that there are these differences, and that maybe there
Yeah.
are things that we can do to empower ourselves. So to the extent that this was helpful for our women in Anne Arundel County, not just in our government, but throughout the
Sure.
county. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time.
Yeah, no worries. Let me know if anything comes up or if you need another copy of slides or anything else.
Absolutely.
Take
Take
care.
care. Bye.